James had always been an ordinary man. His life was defined by routine: wake up early, head to work, put in his hours as an accountant in a small office, then return home to his modest, quiet house. There were no wild adventures or surprises to break the monotony. His social life was limited to the occasional dinner with coworkers or a quiet chat with a neighbor. He liked it that way. Everything had its place, and nothing ever seemed to disrupt the calm flow of his days. It was predictable, and that was how he preferred it. This Friday morning, however, felt like any other. He got up, brewed his coffee, glanced over the headlines of the local newspaper, and prepared for his usual errands. He had a list of items to pick up from the grocery store, and since he was getting paid that day, he decided to treat himself to a few extras. Perhaps some steak for dinner or a nice bottle of wine. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to add a little something to his otherwise humdrum weekend plans. The grocery store wasn't far from his home, just a few blocks away, a place he visited so often the employees almost knew his routine better than he did. There was Sarah, the young cashier who always smiled but didn't chat much, just like him. The bakery section, where they kept the freshest bread, which he always bought, and the produce aisle, where he carefully selected his vegetables, never deviating from his choices. This was a ritual, one he found comfort in. Walking into the store that morning, James didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. He grabbed his cart and began pushing it through the aisles, his mind already focused on his plans for the evening. He could picture himself relaxing with a cold drink, enjoying the steak he planned to cook. Everything was set, just as it always was. But as he made his way down the aisles, something in the air felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was as if something was about to happen, but what? He found his items, filling the cart with things he needed: milk, eggs, vegetables, some snacks to binge on while watching TV, and a few indulgent treats. The trip was going smoothly, and soon he was at the checkout counter. Sarah was there, as usual. She greeted him with a simple, polite smile, scanning each item as he placed them on the belt. "Same as always, huh?" she remarked casually, her tone light and friendly, yet distant. James smiled, replying with a quick, "Yeah, you know me." He didn't expect much more than this. They had exchanged pleasantries before, but it was never more than that. There was a comfort in that, nothing complicated, no deeper connection. Just a friendly cashier and a regular customer. James tapped his card on the reader, waiting for the usual transaction to go through. He didn't think anything of it. The beep came, the screen flashed the total, and then, nothing. The usual prompt for him to insert his PIN was replaced with a red error message. James frowned. Maybe it was just a glitch. He tried again, swiping the card more forcefully this time, but the same thing happened. The error flashed again, louder this time. Excuse me, Sarah," he said, trying to mask the confusion in his voice. "Can you try that again?" Sarah nodded, a hint of concern in her eyes. She swiped the card again, and then again, tapping it on the screen as if doing so would somehow fix the problem. But the error message remained. She glanced up at James, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached for the next option, the backup card reader, an old-school machine where the card could be manually swiped. "This happens sometimes," Sarah said, though her tone was softer now, trying to reassure him. James felt the heat rising in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. He checked his wallet, flipping through the few cards he had. The one he used every time, his debit card, was the one causing the issue. A sense of dread began to creep over him. The thought crossed his mind that perhaps his account had been compromised or that something was wrong with the card. He didn't want to think about it, but the anxiety of the situation started to set in. "Are you sure it's okay?" "This is the only card I have with me," James said, trying to make light of the situation but failing. Sarah gave him a small, sympathetic smile, but her eyes revealed concern. She tried again. The same error message. The beep, the flash of red, nothing. James began to feel the weight of everyone around him. People in line were shifting their weight, subtly glancing his way, as if expecting him to do something, to say something. He noticed an elderly woman behind him give a quiet sigh, her patience growing thin, while a young man further down the line fiddled with his phone, barely looking up. He felt the all-too-familiar sting of embarrassment creeping up on him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't the type of person who had trouble paying for his groceries. This was a mistake. A simple misunderstanding, surely. But why couldn't he fix it? Finally, Sarah paused for a moment, glancing at the card reader and then at James. "Do you want to try another card?" she asked hesitantly, as if she were offering a simple solution. But James didn't have another card. That was it. His debit card was the only form of payment he had at that moment. He could feel his face flush with heat as the reality sank in. "No, that's all I've got," he muttered under his breath, wishing this entire interaction would just end. He glanced toward the exit, feeling the eyes of the other customers boring into him. He could leave, he thought. Walk away from this. Just leave everything here. But as his gaze wandered toward the checkout aisle, he felt something, a hesitation, a need to avoid the embarrassment of walking out empty-handed. Just then, something unexpected happened. Sarah, looking slightly uncomfortable but still trying to remain professional, spoke up. "You know what? I'll cover it for you today," she said, her voice gentle but firm. James blinked at her in confusion, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Wait, what?" he asked, his mind racing. "I'll pay for it." "Don't worry about it," she repeated, her expression calm but resolute. There was no judgment in her voice, just a simple offer. James stared at her, still unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, silencing him. "It's no problem, really. I've got it." For a moment, James just stood there, caught off guard by her generosity. He had never expected anyone, especially a stranger, to offer such an act of kindness. His initial instinct was to decline. He didn't want to feel indebted to anyone, didn't want to appear weak. But as he looked at Sarah, her calm demeanor and genuine offer made him reconsider. After a long, awkward pause, he finally muttered, "Are you sure? I can pay you back." Sarah smiled softly. "No need to pay me back. It's just groceries. I'd want someone to do the same for me if I were in your position." James hesitated, but something in her voice made him reconsider. With a slow nod, he accepted. It was a simple gesture, but it felt so much bigger in the moment. She swiped her own card, the transaction going through with no issues. James took his bags, still stunned, muttering his thanks as he left the counter. He didn't know what else to say. As he walked out of the store, still processing what had just happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. Something bigger, just beneath the surface. He hadn't expected this small act of kindness to leave such a mark on him. And as he reached his car, he couldn't help but wonder about Sarah. Why had she chosen to help him? She didn't know him. He wasn't anything special. Was it just her nature? Or was there something more to it? Something about this encounter felt like it had been set in motion for a reason, but he couldn't yet figure out what. As he drove home, the weight of the moment stayed with him, lingering in his thoughts. Little did James know, this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would alter his life forever. The following days felt strange to James, as though he were walking through a fog, each step uncertain. The kindness Sarah had shown him that day had lingered in his mind. It was a small gesture, really, just a few $100s to cover his groceries, but there was something profound about it. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed out of place in his world, a world where people rarely help strangers without expecting something in return. But Sarah had helped him with no ulterior motive. No hidden agenda. Just pure, simple kindness. It had shaken him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. James found himself replaying the moment over and over in his head. Why had she done it? She didn't even know him, didn't have any reason to offer such generosity. It wasn't like they were close or had any shared history. He was just another customer, another face in the crowd. But Sarah had chosen him. And that thought kept him awake at night. He'd wanted to return the favor, but how could he? How do you repay someone for a kindness that felt so unpayable? It was a week later when James found himself walking back into the same grocery store. He hadn't planned it. In fact, he had tried to avoid it for a few days, not wanting to face the reminder of his embarrassing moment. But the truth was, he needed groceries. And he needed answers. It wasn't just the transaction itself that bothered him, it was the nagging feeling that something bigger was at play, something he wasn't seeing. Something that Sarah wasn't saying. As James pushed his cart down the familiar aisles, he felt the weight of his thoughts dragging behind him. He made his way to the checkout line, expecting Sarah to be there. Sure enough, she was, her gentle smile greeting him as usual, though this time there was a faint trace of something more in her eyes, something like recognition, or maybe it was just curiosity. He wasn't sure. Back again, she asked lightly, scanning his items. Her voice was warm, but there was a subtle shift in her tone, as if she were waiting for something from him. James hesitated for a moment, wondering if she remembered him, if she remembered the day he couldn't pay for his groceries. Did she still feel that kindness toward him, or had it been a one-time thing? "I'm surprised to see you here," Sarah said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. It was as though she'd been waiting for the right moment to say something, but she was unsure how to broach it. "Yeah, well, I needed a few things," James replied, forcing a casual tone. He tried to hide the unease he felt. "It's been a rough week, you know." "I can imagine," Sarah said, her eyes softening as she glanced at him. There was an understanding there, but it wasn't the typical customer-cashier relationship. It felt personal. For a moment, James wondered if he was reading too much into it, but then Sarah said something that took him by surprise. "You're not from around here, are you?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a note of curiosity. James blinked, his heart skipping a beat. She wasn't talking about his groceries or his usual shopping habits. She was talking about him. About who he was. He knew she'd been friendly before, but this felt different. Why did she ask that? "I've lived here for years," James said, trying to sound casual, but inside, his pulse quickened. "I grew up in the town." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, but there was something about the way she held herself that made James feel like she knew more than she was letting on. She gave a quick glance at the other cashier behind her, then leaned in just a little closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Your family," she began, her words almost hesitant, as if she were carefully choosing them. "I know who you are. Or at least, I know who you were." The sentence hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. James stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. His family? What was she talking about? He didn't know what to say, so he did what he always did when faced with something confusing. He laughed, a little too nervously, and tried to brush it off. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," he said, offering a strained smile. But Sarah's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes were sharp, almost searching, as if she were waiting for him to say more. He could feel his heart race in his chest. Something about the way she was looking at him made him uneasy. It was as if she knew something he didn't. Or maybe something he'd forgotten. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," Sarah continued, her voice softening. "It's just, there's something about you. You remind me of someone from the past. Someone I used to know." James felt his stomach twist. His mind raced to understand what she meant. Someone from his past? Who? His family wasn't famous or noteworthy in any way. They were just regular folks, doing the best they could. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. There was nothing about his lineage that anyone would recognize. At least, not that he was aware of. But Sarah's words stuck with him long after he left the store that day. Someone I used to know. It didn't make sense. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he was overthinking it. After all, Sarah was just a cashier. She didn't know him that well. She was probably just being kind, trying to start a conversation. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. What did she mean? How could she know something about his family that he didn't even know himself? The next few days were filled with an odd sense of unease. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. He tried to push the thought to the back of his mind, but it kept coming back, stronger each time. He had to know what Sarah meant. He had to find out what she knew about his past. One evening, after work, James found himself back at the grocery store again. This time, it wasn't for food. He didn't need anything, not really. He just needed answers. When he walked into the store, he didn't see Sarah at first, but he kept his eyes peeled, waiting for her. Finally, he spotted her at the end of the aisle, talking to one of the stock clerks. "Sarah," James called out, his voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet store. She turned toward him, her face lighting up in recognition. He smiled awkwardly. "I need to ask you something." "Of course," she said, walking toward him, her expression warm but cautious. She seemed to sense the tension in his posture. "What's on your mind?" James took a deep breath. "What did you mean the other day when you said you knew my family? What did you mean when you said I remind you of someone from the past?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously to the side, as if she were trying to gauge whether she should answer him. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and serious. "I think you should sit down for this," she said. "There's a lot you don't know. A lot you've been kept in the dark about." The words hit James like a ton of bricks. He felt his chest tighten. What was she talking about? What had he been kept in the dark about? He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. His simple life, the one he had so carefully crafted, was about to unravel in a way he never could have anticipated. James felt his heart pounding in his chest as Sarah's words hung in the air, each syllable laden with tension. The tone in her voice was grave, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his stomach clench. He swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face, trying to understand the gravity behind her statement. "What do you mean?" he managed to croak out, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah took a step closer, her expression serious. "James, you need to know that you're not who you think you are," she said softly, her tone unwavering. "I've recognized something in you, something familiar. It's as if there's a part of your history that's been kept hidden." James's mind raced, trying to grasp what she was saying. "What do you mean?" he repeated, more forcefully this time, feeling a surge of frustration and fear. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to be pushed into an unknown abyss. Sarah took a deep breath, glancing around the empty aisle to ensure no one else was listening. Her eyes were intense as she locked her gaze back on James. "James, your life has been a lie," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "That name, that identity, that's not really who you are." James felt a chill run down his spine. Her words hung in the air between them, and he struggled to comprehend what she had just said. He tried to laugh nervously, but his throat was too dry. "This is a joke, right?" he muttered, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Sarah shook her head slowly, her expression grim. "No, it's not a joke," she said gently but firmly. "I've seen it before. I'm certain there's more to your past than you know." James felt his entire body go cold. His mind spun, trying to comprehend what she was insinuating. Was it some kind of identity mix-up? A prank? But he'd been who he was his entire life. There had never been a question. His parents were the only family he'd ever known, and they had always been there, unconditionally, through every part of his life. He took a step back, feeling a sudden dizziness wash over him. His hands shook, and his chest tightened with a mixture of terror and confusion. He tried to speak but could only manage a stammer. This can't be possible," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm James. That's who I've always been. I'm a regular guy, I work at an office. I've got my routine, my life. I'm normal." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes softening with sympathy. "I understand that it's a shock," she said quietly. "But I've seen it before. There's something about you that reminds me of someone I used to know." James's eyes welled up. "I don't understand. I don't know what you're talking about." "Who are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Sarah took another deep breath, her expression firm yet gentle. "James," she said slowly, "your real name, it might be something else entirely. There are clues. Little things that I've noticed. The way you look, the way you carry yourself. It's as if you're trying to hide something deeper. I've been watching you for weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen you before, in another context, in another time." James stared at her, his eyes glazed, his mind whirring. The world felt like it was spinning out of control. He had always felt comfortable, secure in his life, but now, he felt as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. "What are you saying?" he finally managed to force out, his voice trembling. "Who do you think I am?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before her gaze softened again. "I think you need to dig deeper," she said gently. "There's more to you than meets the eye. You should look into your past, perhaps talk to people who knew you before, if you can find them." James's eyes widened, his face draining of color. The thought of digging into his past felt like opening Pandora's box. His entire identity was built around the person he'd always believed himself to be. The thought of questioning it, of discovering that it might be a lie, filled him with a terror that eclipsed any embarrassment he'd felt at the checkout counter. He felt the urge to flee, to run out of the store and away from this woman, who had brought this revelation into his life, but he couldn't move. His legs were frozen, his eyes locked onto hers. Sarah continued, her tone gentle but firm. "I've lived in this town for a long time, and I've seen things," she said. "People with hidden histories. You might be one of them. I can't say for sure, but I'd be careful if I were you." James could only nod, his brain buzzing with a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. He felt as if he were going insane. He was James. He had been James for as long as he could remember. And yet, the look in Sarah's eyes made him question every certainty he'd held. He finally managed to find his voice, but it was barely a whisper. "Why would you say that?" Sarah smiled softly, her eyes filled with regret. "Because I've seen it happen before. People who have been hiding, who've been living under a false name for years. It's rare, but when it happens, it always has consequences." "I couldn't stay silent about this," she said softly. James glanced down at his shaking hands, feeling as though he were watching someone else's life from afar. He couldn't recall a time when he'd felt more vulnerable, more lost. His entire reality felt like a fragile construct, ready to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He managed to choke out, "What do I do?" Sarah regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "Talk to people from your past," she said quietly. "Try to find someone who knew you before. Start piecing together the truth." James didn't move. He simply stared at her, trying to comprehend her words, his mind racing with questions. Who was he really? And if what she said was true, what other lies had been told? As he left the store that night, the night air hit his face like a slap, and James felt as though he had been reborn. He felt lost, confused, and terrified. The world around him had changed in a way he couldn't have anticipated. He felt as though he had been thrust into a nightmare, one where every bit of his security, his history, and his sense of self was in doubt. And as he drove away, he could feel the pull of uncertainty pulling him. The next few days felt like a blur to James. Every routine, every familiar corner of his life, began to feel foreign. His thoughts were consumed by the cryptic conversation he'd had with Sarah. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that she was right, that his life, as he knew it, had been built on a foundation of half-truths, or worse, lies. But what could he do? How could he possibly dig into a past he didn't even know existed? What would it reveal about him, and what would it cost him to uncover it? James spent the next few nights in his small apartment, poring over old photographs, family albums, and even his childhood memories, looking for something, anything that might offer a clue. His eyes lingered on pictures of family vacations, his parents smiling at the camera, his younger self carefree and oblivious to whatever secrets might be lurking in his history. He scrutinized every face, every image, searching for some hidden detail, a hint of recognition, or even a fleeting moment that might point him in the right direction. But the more he looked, the more he realized how little he actually knew about his own story. His parents had always been the center of his world. They had been his rock, his mother, a schoolteacher who had poured her heart into shaping young minds, and his father, a mechanic who could fix anything with his hands. They were hard-working, kind, and steady. They never spoke much about the past, never lingered on their own histories. There were no family secrets, at least none that James had ever been told about. Everything had been normal. Everything had been simple. Or so he thought. But Sarah's words haunted him. She had said there was more to him than he realized. That his name, his identity, was just a mask for something deeper. It was as though a dark cloud had been cast over his memories, shrouding the past in an eerie fog. What if she was right? What if his family wasn't who they said they were? What if he wasn't who he thought he was? The questions spiraled out of control, gnawing at him until he couldn't focus on anything else. He started to dig deeper, calling old friends and acquaintances from high school, anyone who might have known something about his past. But every conversation was a dead end. Everyone he spoke to described him as the same person he thought he had always been, James, the son of Mark and Susan, a quiet guy who kept to himself. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that stood out. But that didn't reassure him. It only made him more desperate. Why didn't anyone remember anything strange, anything unusual? Was it because it was all buried so deep that even the people closest to him had no idea? Or was it because they were all complicit in the lie? One evening, after another round of failed calls, James decided to visit his parents. Maybe, he thought, they could help him make sense of all this. Maybe they could offer an explanation. After all, they were the ones who had raised him. They would know him better than anyone. His stomach churned with anxiety as he pulled up to their house, the familiar sight of their home giving him little comfort. The white picket fence, the flower beds his mother tended to every spring, it all looked the same, yet nothing felt right anymore. His mother greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile, though there was something in her eyes that seemed off, something he couldn't quite place. She welcomed him inside, and they sat at the kitchen table, where they'd shared countless meals over the years. The smell of her homemade soup filled the room, but even that comforting scent couldn't ease the tension in James's chest. "So, what's on your mind, honey?" his mother asked, stirring the soup absent-mindedly as she watched him. James hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to bring it up. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he knew he had to ask. "Mom," he started, his voice low, "there's something I need to know. Something about our family, something that's been bothering me." His mother looked up at him, her expression softening. "What is it, sweetheart?" You're scaring me. I don't know how to explain it, James replied, his voice trembling slightly. But I think there's something about our past that's not what it seems. Something's been hidden from me. Or maybe I'm just not seeing it. His mother's face went pale, and for the first time in his life, James saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She set down the spoon she had been holding and took a deep breath. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice cracking just slightly. "Sarah, do you remember her?" James asked. "She's the cashier at the grocery store. I think she knows something about me. About our family." His mother stiffened at the mention of Sarah's name, her eyes narrowing. "What does she know?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "I don't know exactly," James said. "But she said something about me not being who I think I am. That my name, my identity, it's all a lie." His mother went silent for a long moment, her hands trembling as she set the spoon down. She looked at James with a mixture of concern and something else, something he couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "James," she said, her eyes filling with tears, "there's something I've been keeping from you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." His heart raced as he leaned in, his mind swirling with 1,000 possibilities. What was she about to say? Was this the moment everything would change? "I never wanted you to find out this way," she continued, her voice trembling. "But it's the truth. The truth that you deserve to know." James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What truth? His mother sighed deeply, as if the weight of years of secrecy was finally bearing down on her. "James, you're not our son," she said, her voice breaking. "At least, not in the way you think. We adopted you when you were just a baby. Your real name, your real family, they're out there. I don't know where, I don't know who they are. But you've never been just the son of Mark and Susan." The words hit James like a physical blow. His mind spun, his vision blurred. His whole life had been a lie. The family he thought he knew, the parents he had loved and trusted, none of it was real. He wasn't their biological son. He wasn't who he had thought he was. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls shrinking as the truth unfolded before him. The life he had built, the identity he had carefully constructed over the years, it was all a lie. His chest constricted as he gasped for air, trying to process what his mother had just told him. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice cracking. How could you keep something like this from me? For my whole life?" His mother's face crumpled with guilt and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, James. I never wanted to hurt you. We loved you from the moment we brought you home. You were our son, in every way that mattered. But we couldn't tell you the truth. Not like this." James stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor as he backed away. "I need to know more," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I need to find out who I really am." His mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she said softly. "But be careful. Some things are better left uncovered. Some truths might hurt more than you think." As James stormed out of the house, his mind raced with 1,000 questions, but one thing was certain, the life he had known was over. James couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal that flooded his chest as he drove away from his parents' house. The weight of his mother's revelation pressed on him like a physical force, a constant reminder of the lie that had shaped his entire existence. For the first time, the world around him felt unstable, as though the foundation beneath his feet had been shattered. Every familiar place, the streetlights, the parks, the buildings, felt foreign. His mind buzzed with one single thought: who was he really? Who was he before his parents took him in? The drive back to his apartment was a blur, but he couldn't escape the questions that overwhelmed him. Every detail of his life now seemed suspect, distorted. Had he ever truly known himself? How could everything he had believed about his identity be false? He had always thought his parents were his real parents. They had raised him, loved him, shaped him into the person he thought he was. But if the truth was what his mother had said, everything had been a lie. The truth that he'd spent his whole life blind to. Had his real parents been out there somewhere? Were they still alive? Were they looking for him? James parked his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to steady his breathing. He needed answers. The gnawing uncertainty was unbearable. But where could he begin? Who could he turn to? His mind was still reeling from the news, trying to make sense of it all. The idea of going to Sarah again seemed terrifying, yet he knew she was the only person who had given him a glimpse of what lay hidden. She had recognized something in him, something that now had to be explored further. He paced around his small apartment, trying to gather his thoughts, but the isolation only made it worse. The walls seemed to close in, echoing with the questions that rang through his head. He needed to find his birth parents. He had to know who they were, where they were, why they had given him up. But where could he start? His mind kept circling back to Sarah. She had mentioned something about clues, something she had seen in him that had made her believe he wasn't just another person, he wasn't just James. But what did she mean by that? Suddenly, his phone buzzed, snapping him out of his spiral. It was a text from his mother, her message short and direct: "You should stop looking for answers. Some things are better left alone." James felt a pang of anger course through him. How could she tell him to stop looking? Didn't she understand? He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Without thinking, he quickly replied, "I have to know. I need to find out who I really am." His phone sat silently after that, no immediate response. His mother's words, "better left alone," echoed in his mind, but they only fueled his desire to search for answers. He had to know who his real family was. There were too many unanswered questions. How could he go on living a life where he didn't even know his true origins? The lie had to end. With a deep breath, James decided to go back to the grocery store where it all began. Sarah had been the one to stir this whole mess, and now he needed more information. If she had recognized something in him, then maybe she knew more than she had let on. Maybe she had seen something that could lead him to answers. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he felt an intense pull to return there. It was his last thread of hope. When James entered the store, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of fresh produce filled the air. It felt like an ordinary place, nothing special. Yet, for him, it had become the starting point of everything that had turned his world upside down. He walked down the aisles, his eyes scanning for Sarah. She wasn't in her usual spot by the register. James felt a fleeting moment of panic before he saw her, standing near the dairy section, her back turned. He approached slowly, his heart beating faster as he neared her. She turned, her eyes locking onto his instantly, and her expression softened, almost regretful. "You came back," she said quietly, her voice full of an emotion James couldn't quite place. "I need to know more," James said, his voice trembling. "You said things aren't what they seem. I have to know what you meant. Please." Sarah looked around, her gaze scanning the store to make sure no one was paying attention. She sighed, looking back at James. "I didn't want to drag you into this," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "But I can't just leave you in the dark. You're not just any person. There's something about you that doesn't add up. And I can't explain it all to you right now, but I can tell you where to start." James felt a surge of anticipation. "Where? What do I need to do?" Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing in thought. "There's a man. His name is Ben Foster. He's the key. You need to find him. He knows more about you than anyone." "Ben Foster?" James repeated, his mind racing. "Who is he?" "I can't explain everything now, but he's someone who's been watching over you for years. He has information about your past. It's the only way you'll get the answers you need, Sarah said, lowering her voice. Where do I find him? James asked, barely able to process the words. Start with the old neighborhood, Sarah replied. He used to live there before he disappeared. I'm telling you, you need to find him. He's the key to everything. But be careful, James. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. James nodded, his heart pounding. It felt like a strange, cryptic puzzle, and Ben Foster was the missing piece. The man who had been watching him for years. He didn't know what kind of man he was or why he had been keeping tabs on James, but this was his only lead. He had to find him. As he walked out of the store, the weight of what Sarah had said pressed heavily on him. The sense of urgency had taken over, but so had the fear. What had he just gotten himself into? His entire life was unraveling before his eyes. Everything that had seemed stable, his job, his friendships, his sense of self, was now uncertain. James spent the next few days searching through old records, tracking down leads, trying to find any connection to Ben Foster. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. The search took him through neighborhoods he'd never been to, into dusty old libraries where he sifted through decades-old newspaper clippings, looking for anything that might explain who Ben Foster was and why he had been watching him. He felt like a detective in his own life, trying to solve a mystery that had been buried for decades. Finally, after days of digging, he stumbled upon an address, a run-down house on the edge of town, far removed from the places he'd known. The name Ben Foster had come up in an old court document related to a missing persons case from years ago. It was all so strange, so vague, but it felt like he was getting closer. Every step he took brought him closer to the truth, but also deeper into the unknown. As James stood in front of the house that afternoon, he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What would he find here? Who was Ben Foster, and what did he know about James's past? He knocked on the door, his hand trembling. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an older man with a tired, weathered face. His eyes were sharp, cautious, as if he'd been expecting this moment for a long time. James, the man said, his voice gruff but knowing. I've been waiting for you. The words sent a chill down James's spine. He stepped into the house, the feeling that he was crossing into a new, dangerous chapter of his life creeping over him. Everything he had believed up until this moment had been a lie. Now, the truth was within his grasp. But at what cost? James stepped into the dimly lit house, the faint smell of dust and old wood filling the air. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with books, photographs, and various knickknacks, all casting long shadows in the low light. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood on the threshold, unsure of what he would find inside. Ben Foster, this man who had been watching him for so long, was standing just a few feet away, his gaze heavy with the weight of years of silence and hidden knowledge. The moment James crossed the threshold, he knew there was no turning back. This was it. The answers he had been searching for, the truth about his identity, were about to be revealed. Ben's eyes studied James closely, like someone who had been anticipating this meeting for a long time. There was something unsettling about his gaze, a knowing quality that made James feel both exposed and vulnerable. The man didn't look like a stranger. There was something in his features, something familiar about him that James couldn't quite place. His mind raced with questions, but before he could speak, Ben motioned for him to sit. He led James to a worn leather chair by a small, low table. The silence between them was thick, hanging in the air like an invisible weight. I knew you'd come, Ben finally said, his voice rough but calm, as though he had been waiting for this moment for years. James didn't know how to respond. The tension in the room was palpable, and every word seemed loaded with significance. How long have you known? He asked, his voice trembling. How long have you been following me? Ben's expression softened, and he took a slow breath. It's not what you think. I wasn't following you in the way you might imagine. I was protecting you. Protecting me? James echoed, confusion and disbelief mixing in his voice. From what? From who? Ben's eyes flickered, and he lowered his gaze, as though weighing the right words. From the truth, he said finally. From what you really are. James's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, what I really am? His pulse quickened, and his hands clenched at his sides. The air seemed to thicken around him as the walls of the room felt like they were closing in. This wasn't just about finding out who his birth parents were anymore. There was something deeper at play. Ben stood up slowly, walked over to the window, and gazed out into the darkness. The flickering streetlights cast strange shadows across his face, making his features appear even more mysterious. It's not just about your parents, Ben said, his voice low and measured. It's about your past. About the man you were before they found you. James's head spun. Before they found me? What are you talking about? I've always been James. Ben turned to face him, his eyes intense, as if searching for some hidden understanding in James's expression. No, James. You weren't always James. Your real name was never James. You weren't born into the life you think you had. Your story goes much deeper than what your parents told you. And now, it's time for you to understand the truth. James's mind whirled, the world around him spinning uncontrollably. Everything he had known was starting to unravel, and the pieces he had been trying to fit together for days were beginning to make a terrifying kind of sense. I don't understand, he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of the truth pressing in on him. Ben looked at him gravely, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. You were part of a secret project, James. A project that involved people like you, people who were meant to be something more than ordinary. Your birth parents were part of this. They were involved in something much bigger, and they gave you up because they couldn't protect you anymore. James's breath caught in his throat. A project? What kind of project? What are you saying? Ben walked closer, sitting down across from him, and leaned in. It was a government experiment. They were trying to create people with abilities. People who could do things that ordinary humans couldn't. They didn't want you to know, and they certainly didn't want you to remember. James shook his head, feeling a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He had heard stories about government experiments, about people being used as pawns, manipulated and controlled, but he never thought he would be a part of one. This is crazy, he muttered. You're telling me I was part of some experiment? That I'm some kind of, what? A weapon? Some kind of test subject? Ben's expression grew serious. No, not a weapon. But yes, a test subject. You have abilities, James. You always have. They were dormant for years, but they're starting to awaken. That's why you're feeling all this confusion. It's why your life doesn't feel right. Your real parents, your biological parents, they were part of a team that helped develop this project. And when you were born, they knew that your abilities would be too dangerous for the world to handle. That's why they had to disappear. They couldn't let you grow up under their watch. James was reeling from the revelation. What kind of abilities, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer, but he had to know. Ben met his gaze, his expression filled with a mix of concern and caution. You have the ability to manipulate energy, James. You can control it, bend it to your will. You've always had this power, but it's been lying dormant inside you. Over time, it's been growing stronger, but you haven't known how to control it. It's been manifesting in subtle ways, but now it's starting to become more noticeable. And that's why they were watching you, why they kept an eye on you all these years. James felt his head spin, the weight of Ben's words threatening to crush him. I can manipulate energy? How? Why didn't I know? How could my parents hide this from me? Ben's face softened with sympathy. Your parents didn't know, James. They weren't the ones who raised you for that reason. They were trying to protect you from your own abilities, trying to keep you safe from the people who would exploit you. When you were young, they had to take you away from everything, your birth parents, the project, the government. They erased all traces of you, hid you in plain sight, so no one could ever find you again. But it wasn't enough. The people behind this project, they never stopped looking for you. James felt like the ground beneath him was falling away. His whole life had been a lie. His real parents, his true identity, his abilities, it was all so much to process. He could barely grasp the reality of the situation. So, what now? He asked, his voice thick with confusion. What am I supposed to do with all of this? Ben stood up and walked over to a drawer, pulling out a folder filled with papers. He handed it to James, who flipped it open with trembling hands. Inside were files, documents, and photographs, pictures of a young boy, different from the one James had known. In every photo, the boy seemed to have the same eyes, his eyes. It was a strange and unsettling feeling to see images of someone who looked like him, but wasn't him. Someone who had been erased from history. Now, Ben said, you have to make a choice. You can continue running, hiding from the truth, or you can step into the reality that was always meant for you. But be careful. The people who were behind this project, they never stopped looking for you. They know who you are, and they will stop at nothing to control you. If you choose to embrace your abilities, if you choose to reclaim your past, you'll have to fight for your freedom. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe. But it will be your choice. James stared at the papers, the weight of the decision pressing on him like 1,000 pounds. What would he do now? Could he accept this new truth? Could he embrace the power that had always been inside him? Or would he run from it, forever hiding from the person he was meant to be? The choice was his. And whatever he decided, there would be no going. James sat there, staring at the papers in his hands, the weight of the decision suffocating him. His whole world had just been flipped upside down. All the questions that had been swirling in his mind for weeks, about his identity, his past, his abilities, were finally starting to make sense. But with that clarity came an overwhelming fear. What would his life look like now? How would he navigate this new reality? He wasn't just a man with a normal job and a simple life anymore. He was someone with extraordinary powers, someone who was part of a shadowy government experiment that had been manipulating his life since birth. The thought made his stomach churn. He had spent his entire life thinking he was one person, but now he was being told that his true self was someone entirely different. How could he reconcile the man he thought he was with the person Ben Foster was telling him he could become? Could he even trust this man? Everything in his life had been a lie, and now he had to decide whether to embrace a truth that seemed far too unbelievable to be real. Ben stood in front of him, waiting patiently, but James could see the anxiety in his eyes. It wasn't just the weight of what he had to say next, it was the fact that he knew the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about helping James find his true parents or understand his abilities. This was about survival. The world Ben was alluding to wasn't one of simple explanations or safe choices. It was a world of danger, of secrets, and most importantly, of power that could easily be misused. James thought back to his life before this whirlwind of revelations. Before all of this, he had been ordinary, just another face in the crowd, someone with a job, a home, and friends. But now, that life felt like a distant memory. How could he go back to that? How could he return to the mundane when he now knew that his very existence had been shaped by forces much bigger and more sinister than he could have ever imagined? Back. Ben, sensing his hesitation, spoke again. James, I know this is a lot to process. I'm not expecting you to make a decision right away. But I need you to understand something. These abilities you have, they're not just a gift. They're a responsibility. You're not the only one who has them. There are others like you, others who've been hidden for their entire lives, and they're out there. Some of them are using their powers for good. Others, not so much. James looked up at him, the tension in the room thickening. What do you mean? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to join your fight, to take down these people who've been controlling me? Ben shook his head, his expression grave. I don't want you to join anything, James. Not yet. Not unless you're ready. I want you to understand the stakes. You don't have to make a choice today. But you will have to choose. The people behind this project, they've been controlling you from the start. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Your abilities are too powerful for them to ignore. And when they realize you're waking up to the truth, they'll come for you. The words hit James like a blow to the chest. His mind raced. People were after him? For what? He had no idea how to use these abilities that Ben was talking about. He had never been trained, never been taught how to control anything. How could he possibly stand up to whatever forces were out there? And what about my real parents? James asked, the words coming out almost in a whisper. What happened to them? Why did they leave me? Ben's face softened for a moment, and he sighed. Your birth parents, they were part of the project, yes. But they didn't want you to be a part of it. They knew that your abilities were too dangerous for the world to understand. They loved you, James. That's why they gave you up. They thought it was the only way to protect you. But if they loved me, why didn't they fight for me? James asked, his voice cracking. Why didn't they come for me? Ben looked away, his eyes clouded with regret. They tried. But the people who run this project, they don't care about love. They don't care about families. They only care about control. Your parents were forced to disappear. They went underground, and even now, they're in hiding. The people who ran the experiment, they'll stop at nothing to find them and finish what they started. James felt a pang in his chest as he processed Ben's words. His real parents had wanted to protect him, had wanted to love him, but they hadn't been able to. They had been forced to leave him behind. And now, as much as he wanted to find them, he knew he couldn't just go on a simple search. The people who had controlled his life would stop at nothing to keep him from the truth. He stood up abruptly, pacing around the small room, his mind racing. So what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to hide forever? Am I supposed to be some kind of weapon, to fight these people? Ben's voice grew softer, but there was an urgency in it that James couldn't ignore. You don't have to be a weapon, James. But you do have to decide what kind of life you want to live. You can't run forever. Your abilities are part of who you are. They always will be. But how you use them, that's your choice. James stopped pacing and turned back to face Ben, a sense of determination beginning to rise in him. And if I choose to fight? What happens then? Do I just become like all the others? A tool for some greater cause? Ben shook his head, his eyes narrowing with a hint of warning. Not all of us are tools, James. Some of us are fighting for the right reasons. But be careful. Once you enter this world, there's no going back. You'll have to make choices, and not all of them will be easy. You might lose friends. You might lose everything you thought you knew. But in the end, you'll have to ask yourself, what's worth fighting for? The truth? The people you love? Or a life free of the people who want to control you? James's chest tightened as the weight of Ben's words settled over him. What was worth fighting for? Could he live in the shadows forever, or would he have to take control of his own life, his own destiny, even if it meant facing the monsters who had shaped his world? The silence in the room was deafening as James stood frozen, torn between fear and the possibility of freedom. Every instinct told him to run, to hide, to go back to his old life. But now, in the face of all he had learned, that life seemed like a distant memory. He could no longer pretend that he was just an ordinary man. He could no longer ignore the power that lay dormant inside him, or the darkness that surrounded it. Ben waited patiently, giving James the space he needed to think. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, James spoke, his voice steady but filled with a resolve he hadn't felt before. "I'll fight," James said, his words firm. "I'll fight for the truth. For my family. And for the life I was meant to have." Ben's expression softened with a mixture of approval and concern. "Good," he said quietly. "But remember, James. You're not alone in this. There are others out there who will help you. But there are also people who will try to stop you. You have to be ready for whatever comes next. The fight for your freedom has only just begun." James nodded, his heart pounding with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held or what dangers lay ahead, but he had made his choice. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was taking control of his own destiny. As he turned to leave Ben's house, the weight of everything he had learned felt both crushing and liberating. The truth was out there. It was messy, complicated, and terrifying, but it was his truth. And now, he would fight for it, no matter the cost. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it head-on. He wouldn't back down. The fight for his life, for his family, and for the truth had only just begun.